how 2.6 million euro disappeared on a dark August night. Just after midnight on August 8, 1963, a Royal Mail train was moving through the English countryside. Inside were 120 sacks of money carrying more than 2.6 million euro. But the people waiting for that train weren't passengers. They were criminals. They knew the train's routes. They knew what it was carrying, and they had planned exactly where they wanted it to stop. Within minutes, one of Britain's most famous robberies was underway. The criminals would escape with millions, but they would also make one vital mistake, and that mistake would eventually help investigators find them. This is the story of the Great Train Robbery. The story begins with a Royal Mail train traveling from Glasgow toward London. The train carried mail and valuable shipments, including a huge amount of cash being transported to banks in London. For the criminals planning the robbery, this wasn't a random target. They had information. They knew the train's route. They knew roughly when it would pass through the countryside, and they understood that if they could stop the train at the right location, they could potentially take the money and disappear before anyone could react. But stopping a moving train wasn't simple. The gang needed a plan, and they needed right people. The plan. The robbery was carefully organized. The gang's plan depended on controlling the train and separating the people inside from the money they wanted. The location they chose was near Bridego Bridge in Buckinghamshire. It was isolated enough to give them time. The plan was simple in theory: stop the train, control the crew, and reach the money and escape. But there was one major problem. A train cannot simply be pulled over like a car. The criminals needed to find a way to make the train stop, so they interfered with the railway signaling system. The train approached the area in the early hours of the morning, and then suddenly it stopped. The plan was now in motion. The robbery. The gang moved quickly. The train driver was confronted, and the criminals took control of the situation. The money they were looking for was in the train's high-value package coach. The gang forced their way into the coach and began removing the sacks of cash. The robbery itself was surprisingly fast compared with the scale of what they were stealing. Millions of pounds were being moved from a moving mail train without waiting vehicles. The criminals had prepared for this moment. They had vehicles ready, they had a route planned, and they had a destination where they believed they could hide safely. But they couldn't take everything. The amount of money was enormous, and moving so much cash took time. Eventually, the gang left the scene. They had successfully escaped with millions. At least that was what they thought. The escape. The criminals drove away from the railway and headed toward a farmhouse that they had prepared as a temporary hideout. For a moment, it seemed like the plan had worked perfectly. The train had been stopped, the money had been stolen, and the gang had escaped. But the farmhouse would become one of the most important locations in the entire investigation. The criminals had made a critical mistake. They didn't leave the farmhouse immediately. Instead, they stayed there while the police investigation was already beginning. And while they were there, they left behind something that investigators could use: evidence. The criminals eventually abandoned the farmhouse, but the police would soon arrive. And what investigators discovered there would change the entire case. The investigation. The robbery immediately became a major police investigation. Investigators knew that they were dealing with a huge and carefully organized operation. but they didn't initially know exactly who was responsible. The criminals had disappeared. The money was gone, and there were few obvious leads. Then investigators examined the farmhouse. Inside, they found evidence that the gang had been there. Among the items left behind was a monopoly board. It may seem insignificant, but investigators discovered fingerprints connected to the people who had used the farmhouse. That evidence became an important part of the investigation. The criminals had focused so carefully on planning the robbery, but they had overlooked something much simpler: their fingerprints. The arrest. The investigators began closing in on the people responsible. Evidence gathered from the farmhouse helped police identify suspects. Arrests followed. The case eventually went to court, and a number of people were convicted for their involvement in the robbery. But the story didn't end there. Some of the criminals later escaped from prison or remained on the run for years. The stolen money also became a mystery of its own. Although some of the money was recovered, a large amount was never found. To this day, questions remain about exactly where all of the missing money went. Yeah.